Good afternoon. Welcome to the Roper Roundtable for the fall of 2025. We're excited to have you join us this afternoon. We've got a good conversation with Joe Lenski and Murray Edelman. They'll be discussing the evolution of election night analysis and projections. We also are joined by our Roper Center Director of Data Operations and Communications, Kathleen Weldon. And my name is Rachel McNabb. I'm the administrative assistant here at the Roper Center. I have a couple of housekeeping notes and then I will hand it over to Kathleen. Just wanted to let you know that we are recording this session for future reference. And also, as far as the questions and answers, we will have a questions and answers portion at the end of the discussion. And if you would like to enter any questions, go ahead and do that in the question and answer box there. I know that we've had a couple emailed ahead of time, and we do have a good conversation, and we're hoping to have some good questions as well. So I will hand it over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you all for being here. It is my privilege to introduce our two speakers, the giants in the field, absolute giants in the field. And the first will be Murray Edelman. As head of Edelman Research, he has consulted on elections and surveys for CBS News since 2005. From 1993 to 2003, he conducted state and national exit polls and election projections for all the major news organizations. And going back a little further, from 1967 through 1992, he worked with Warren Mitofsky at CBS News in creating the exit poll and projection methods that have been used through the 2024 election. He has been a distinguished visiting professor at Rutgers University and inducted in the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame for both his activism and pioneering research on gay and lesbian voters. He has also been president and conference chair of National APOR, as well as president of New York APOR, and winner of the 2005 New York APOR Award for Outstanding Achievement. After Murray does his first presentation, Joe will take over. Joe Lenski is Executive Vice President at SSRS. He was co-founder and Executive Vice President of Edison Research from 1994 to 2025, until its recent acquisition by SSRS. Under his supervision, Edison Research has conducted all state and national exit polls for the major news organizations since 2003. Edison Research has also conducted exit polls for national elections in Iraq, Venezuela, and the Republic of Georgia. Lenski began his career in survey research at the CBS News Election and Survey Unit in 1987 and consulted for the exit poll consortiums VRS and VNS before co-founding Edison Research in 1994. Lenski has served on the Executive Council for the American Association for Public Opinion Research, that is APOR, and as president of the New York chapter of APOR. And now that you know who we're going to be listening to, I will hand the reins over to Murray Edelman.
Thank you, Kathleen. I wanted to start by kind of giving you the origin story of the exit poll, and then take you through kind of the timeline of how exit polling has evolved and how projections have evolved as well. Throughout all this, we need to refer to Warren Mitofsky a lot. Warren is the person that the Mitofsky Award is named after, and also he was someone I worked directly with for a very long time, from the start in 1967, actually 1965, and then Joe worked with him for quite a bit afterwards, which you will see when I do the timeline. But before I go to a slide, I just wanted to give you the origin story of the exit poll and the projections. I met Warren in 1965. We were working at the Census Bureau, and we were learning probability sampling, which was relatively new at the time. and the people at the Bureau were like the masters of it. In 1967, he moved to CBS and took over he brought probability sampling to the whole the beginning field of projecting elections. And I was a grad student at the time, and he brought me in as a consultant. So I kind of weaved in and out for those first few years. And then later on, I became full-time. So in 1967, in the off year, he was testing the system and used an exit poll in the Kentucky. Kentucky is a state that is in two time zones. And the principle at that time was that we would not call a race unless the majority of the polls were closed in the state. Not the whole state, but the majority of the polls. That's since changed, but that was at the time. And so he came up with an exit poll to see what was going on in the western part of the state. So when we called the state, if we called the state at poll closing, we wouldn't be surprised. He had gotten the idea from Mike Fine, who had done intercept polling at movie theaters. And at that time, the exit poll was just, who did you vote for? In 1970, when I came to New York, we had one of our many lunches. I told him I had this great idea, and he was all ears because he loves ideas. And I told him we should do demographics and questions on the exit poll. And he said, "Yeah, I thought of that, but it's such a mess to do all that. It's operational." I said, "Well, we can work out the operations, but look, you have real voters. Think about that. You're actually interviewing real voters. When you do the other polling, you're doing maybe voters. Are you planning to vote? Blah, 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 blah. We have these different ways of trying to figure out if they voted. And here you have real voters. That's got to be worth something." And he said, "Well, yeah, that is. But then there's still a lot of operations." And I said, "But Warren, you know the truth. You can actually wait to the truth. At an hour after poll closing, we'll have decent estimates of the outcome. And then by the end of the night, we'll know the outcome. I mean, who else knows the truth of what they're doing surveys for?" And that kind of got to him. And when I came back in November, there was an exit poll, and that was the first time we'd done it. And he did it as a test. And then in 1972 was the first one that was released. And that, by the way, is at the Roper Center, as is every exit poll from then on. So I'm going to take you now, as soon as I get my slides working. So let's see, I share first, right? Up. Now, share. Is that good? Yay. So here's the 67 is what I mentioned. Then and then 70 was the demographics. Then so for that decade, CBS just did small exit polls. We did like a national exit poll and a couple states, and we just did it for analysis. Then in 1980, NBC used exit polls everywhere to call races, and they beat everybody. Now, at this time, election projections were very, very competitive. The networks put a lot of money in it because they were fighting for share of the audience, and they had a lot of money. There were three major networks, very different than it is today. So when NBC started doing exit polls, then everybody, ABC and CBS, had to do exit polls everywhere. So exit polls, there were lots of money on exit polls and lots of exit polls. Then in 1990, prior to that, Warren had gathered together ABC, the three networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and then CNN was interested. And he had suggested, why don't we pool our resources? Warren wanted to be a separate company. And then we offered them, you get out of the business of doing exit polls. You can put your resources more into news. You get out of the business of doing exit polls. We'll do it. We're a survey group. We'll use our OFIA resources to do surveys and do other things. We'll make it really worth it for you, etc. And so we had that going for a while, and it looked like it might actually work, but the networks decided no, they'd rather have control. They just were not willing to give up control. So they eventually took us on as the consortium. We did it, and it was called Voter Research and Surveys. And I'll show you a little bit of that when I talk about the questionnaire, because we had to pull together a lot of different things. Then in '93, the networks added the AP and Fox, and they also expanded to do the vote count, made it a much bigger production. And in effect, Warren got pushed out of it. And I took over the exit poll during that period. And I had it pretty much completely. In 1994, and I had projections. In '94, ABC called races a few races ahead of me. Up until that point, when we were the consortium in 1990 on, there was a kind of agreement that the consortium would make the calls and they would review them, but basically pass them on. And in '94, ABC got the jump in some races. So from then on, each network then had to compete and have their own staff to do elections and stuff like that, to make calls. So the competition, so they were now competing over the same data sets, using the same data sets. And in 2000, we had Florida, where we called the race for Gore at 7:52 p.m. and November 5th. And then later that night at 2 o'clock, the networks called it for Bush and then had to retract that. That was a pretty awful night. And the ensuing time was pretty awful. I ended up in front of Congress having to defend what we were doing. Excuse me. The exit poll was blamed a lot for this, but in fact, it had nothing to do with the problem. And I'll go into more if you all want. But one of the results was that the networks then decided that they had to redo our whole computer system because it was so outmoded. They'd been putting it off, and they needed to look like they were doing something to make things better. Even though the corrections we made in the model were very small corrections, they felt the need to do something big, plus we needed it. And so they pushed to get it all done by 2002. They hired a contractor, Battelle, and at our the people at VNS, the programmers were just didn't think it could be done, but anyway, the board pushed it on, and it just didn't work. And so 2002, we had no projections. So worst election night of my life. I thought 2000 was, but 2002 became the worst. And then after that, they decided maybe they should get out of the election business. VNS, where I worked, had 4 different directors, executive directors, over 10 years. So they listened again. This time Warren came with an offer along with Joe, and and that was very attractive to them to get out of the business completely. And then Joe then will take over from 2003 till today. So now I'm going to spend a little bit of time now just, excuse me, going over with you how we do an exit poll and how it's evolved. And then during my stay, and then Joe will take it from there. So this is a state. We divide it into, like in this case, 5 different geographic areas based on voting, and they're contiguous areas. We take a list of all the precincts in a previous election. We stratify them. In other words, we break them into groups by geography, by our 5 regions, by size, and we order them by past vote. We select the precincts proportionate to size of the past vote. Excuse me, and then we take a subsample for the exit poll. We interview we put the interviewers as close as possible to the polling place. The interviews are self-administered. We have fairly involved protocols of sampling each voter. If there's 2 exits, we have the interviewer go half the time in one exit, half the time in another exit. We've adopted the full kind of probability sampling concept. The interviewer keeps a record of the sex, race, and age of the voters. And in fact, it actually works. People say, how can you estimate ages? But we're really doing it by categories, and it's pretty accurate. And we know because we have them estimate the ages of the people that fill out questionnaires as well. We've done that in tests. And then we have 3 input calls. Here's an example of the age, race, sex forms that we use. We have like 3 age categories. This is a ballot box. So the person is given the questionnaire. We tell them, we don't want your name, just your opinions, and we show them they can fold it up and put it in the box. This is a questionnaire. This is one that this was, I think, from 2000. Yeah, this is 2000. You can see that there's demographics. We ask who they voted for, when they made up their decision, and then what's the most important issue in determining their vote, and things like that. So it's very immediate. We're getting people right after they voted. Now, one of the more interesting things is the age category. This has got to be the strangest age category you've ever seen. And the reason it is these categories, it was because of a compromise. When the 3 networks came together, each one had its own age categories. And they each had a trend over these age categories. So they didn't want to give up their trends. So we managed to make this our question. And then when we create tabulations, we have a CBS category and NBC categories and ABC categories. We also had a problem with religion. If I recall, NBC asked, what is your religious background? CBS asked, what is your religious preference? And ABC asked, what is your religion? We eventually ended up with, are you? And then we listed the religions. And both of these questions have lasted in this form till 2024. So on election day, we have, this is in 2000, this is the size of the field that we order. 1,400, we have 1,400 survey interviewers hired, and we have 140, when we take in 140,000 interviews, that's what we take in. In addition, for counting the vote, we have 4,600 reporters. We had 29,000 people at precincts, which we haven't done much. I stopped doing quite a while ago. And we had 2,700 sample precinct reporters. In election day output, we made 108 statewide projections, 435 house calls, 50 individual state crosstabs. We did national crosstabs, interactive crosstabs, and tabulated the vote. And we delivered that to the members and 110 newspapers and local stations. And that was BNS. That was we were at the time. So I will stop now. So thank you.
Thank you, Murray.
Oh, I got it. Let me get out of this.
Yeah, and I'll.
Oh, there it is.
Everyone see my, Murray, can you see my slides? Oh,
There we go. I'm out now.
okay. Let me get my slides.
There we go. Oh, that's okay. They can see it, but it's okay.
Sorry, I seem to be having trouble getting my slides up.
Visible, Joe.
You see them?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Let me take the evolution of exit polling from the point Murray described. In 2003, Warren and I put a proposal together for the news organizations, and they formed what they called NEP, the National Election Pool, and Edison Research and Mitofsky International delivered exit polls to the news organizations and their subscribers starting in 2003. Warren passed away in 2006, but we've continued since Edison providing the exit polls to the NEP until 2024. And I'll go through some of the evolution of the process of exit polling and how it's changed as voters have changed over the years. I just wanted to do a brief slide here. These are all the exit polls Edison did for the NEP over the last 22 years, and all of them are available at the Roper Center. So please use this data. A lot of work was put behind it, but it provides a historical record, as Murray said, going back to the 70s of every major election in the United States. And as Kathleen said earlier, Edison also has done international exit polls from places as widespread as Azerbaijan, the Republic of Georgia, to just last year in Venezuela, and the first exit poll ever conducted in Iraq, using a lot of the similar methodologies that Murray described. I'm just going to go through real briefly some of the issues we've had to face as the way people voted has evolved and the way people take surveys have evolved. And I'll go through how we've tackled these issues over the last 20 years and how we are going to tackle them in the future. First is the security of the data. And as Murray said, the national news organizations have made a pledge to Congress not to categorize the results of any race based on exit poll data until all the polls have closed in the race. And as Murray said, that evolved after Florida, when the rule was a majority of polls in the state have closed. And in Florida, that majority was in the Eastern time zone, but the panhandle was left out when they felt left out when the call was made before their polls have closed. So since 2000, all projections made by the news organizations take place after all the polls in a single state have closed. In 2004, our first national election as Edison providing to the NEP, a lot of data was leaked during election day to various websites. Those of you around then know that you could have gone on the Drudge Report and seen that Kerry had an early small lead in our exit polls, and that made for news, even though the exit poll wasn't completed yet. So after that experience in 2004, the NEP established what is now called an embargo room, what then we called the quarantine. And literally, it was a physical room where we supplied data during the day to only 2 or 3 representatives of each news organization, and they were quarantined. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have access to the internet. They couldn't talk to anyone else at their news organizations until 5 o'clock. And this procedure solved the leaking of data before 5 o'clock. So, and it still exists to this day. It's not a physical room where everyone is quarantined, but each network has their own embargo space where only a handful of people at each news organization can look at the data before 5 p.m. The other big change over the last few decades is the percent of voters who no longer vote on election day at a polling place. When Murray and Warren devised exit polling in the 60s and 70s, more than 90% of voters voted at their local polling place on election day. So the exit poll had more than 90% coverage. As you can see over the years, especially after 2000, the number of people voting either by mail or early in person spiked up, and it even spiked up more during the COVID election of 2020. We are at the point now where consistently nationally, more than half of the votes are cast either by mail or early in person before election day. And the exit poll has had to evolve to deal with that. So since Edison has run the exit poll in reality is a multi-mode survey. We are doing interviews on election day of election day voters, but we're also doing in-person interviews of early voters at early voting polling locations, and multiple mode. We're using multi-modes of interviewing of by mail and early voters based on a registration-based sample. And in 2024, that consisted of telephone surveys, landline and cell, text to web surveys, and email surveys, all off the voter roll. So everything that's been referred to as an exit poll, while election day in-person interviewing is a portion of that, it's still a multi-mode survey and has been for the last few decades. The other issue is an issue that faces surveys regardless of method, and that's dropping response rates. Murray, you might want to say what the original response rates were in the 70s and 80s, but they were well over 60%, I believe, back then. As you can see, they've slowly but surely dropped from when we started doing it in 2004. Response rates were about 53%. In the last general election, they were 39%. So that means issues about who refuses to take the survey have more and more of an impact as response rates have decreased over the last few decades. And we have many strategies for dealing with differential non-response. As Murray mentioned, the first strategy was having interviewers record the age, race, and gender of the people who refused to take the survey and adjust the sample according to that non-response. That does a really good job of taking into account that younger people are more likely than older people to take in the survey. And in certain elections, men may have different response rates from women, but there's other demographic categories that we know have differential non-response. Education, college educated voters are more likely to fill out a survey than non-college educated voters. We know there's also differences by income, and there's differences by political parties. In 2018, after the 2016 election showed that differential non-response by education had an influence on both pre-election polls and exit polls, we introduced a non-response adjustment for education based on the historical comparison of the census election surveys to the exit polls, and found that there was a consistent difference between the two. And we, starting in 2018, adjusted our response rates by education accordingly, and have been in line with most of the other election surveys since. So I have some news. As of this week, we are, as as mentioned earlier, Edison has been acquired by our friends at SSRS, and we have a much bigger team now to put together the surveys. And we introduced this week what will be called going forward the voter poll by SSRS. It will have its inaugural debut next Tuesday in the elections we're covering in California, New Jersey, New York City, and Virginia. And it is basically taking the evolution of election polling to the next step. It's taking what Edison's developed over the years in terms of in-person election day interviewing, what our friends at AP, NORC, and Fox have developed at Votecast in their pre-election online surveys, and the experience that SSRS has in building their panel and doing voter roll-based surveys for many news organizations, including CNN, and putting that all together in a multi-mode survey that will incorporate still election day in-person interviewing, but multiple samples and multiple modes of interviewing verified voters before election day. And so I see this as the next step of where we are now, where the majority of voters do not vote on election day. If I think, Murray, if you, me, and Warren were around the table right now trying to devise a way to make sure we have voters, as you said, we know when they walk out of the polling place, they're a voter. We also now can verify the vote based on the voter roll, because the voter rolls update as people vote early and by mail in most states. And we can now provide a survey that, regardless of the mode we're using, whether it's in-person election day, by telephone, RBS, opt-in, probability panels, we can put that all together to reflect an electorate that represents the entire state or city that we're covering. And that's what we're introducing next Tuesday in California, New Jersey, New York City, and Virginia, and hopefully in the future. So that's my evolution of the last 22 years of exit polling in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Murray and Joe. That was fascinating. That was incredible, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions coming in. And while we wait for those to come in, I want to not so much announce, but remind everyone that Murray and Joe are the recipients of the 2025 Roper Center Warren J. Mitofsky Award for Excellence in Public Opinion Research. And we will be celebrating that at an awards ceremony in New York City on November 13th. So I believe you can still get tickets. So please consider joining us in celebrating their many, many years of fantastic work. So just to start, while waiting for any questions to come in from the live audience, we did, as Rachel said, get a question ahead of time about the 2000, I think it was described as a debacle. What sort of effect did that have on the perceived reliability of exit polling? Was there a crisis in confidence that really took time to rebuild that sort of sense that the exit polls are a solid source of information? Either one of you want to take that?
Well, I'll just say a little bit about it. I'm not sure. It was very frustrating for me because the networks really wanted to keep control of the story after that, and so I was not really allowed to defend what was going on. And it was really awful. The newspapers seemed to blame the exit poll for everything. I mean, even for the Bush call that was done at 2 o'clock in the morning, they were blaming the exit poll for that. And it was just really terrible. And it just kept going. I never felt that anybody in the profession or anyone that knew what was going on lost confidence. I never felt that from anybody. But I don't know. I don't know, Joe, maybe you should take that one.
Well, I think the exit poll suffers from a lot of the same things that news media in general suffer for in terms of eroding trust levels in organizations, even beyond Florida in 2000. As I said, we've been dealing just about every cycle with building the credibility of the exit poll and trying to deal with situations that undermine the credibility of the exit poll. As I said in 2004, the leaking of data early showing a slight Kerry lead led to a lot of questioning of the validity of the exit poll. In 2016, the education bias in the exit poll led to a lot of debate, and we made changes to adjust for that. As I said, the change in how voters have voted and how many more people vote before election day led to changes in our methodology. And the fact that the news organizations keep calling it an exit poll, I think, made it more difficult to explain to people that it's truly a multi-mode survey now. We're interviewing voters wherever they are, whether they vote by mail or before election day or on election day, and we're using survey methodologies like everyone in the industry is using multi-mode methodologies to make sure everyone is covered, whether it's by phone, by mail, text to web, by email, in person, etc. So I think maintaining the credibility of the exit poll, I think, is a very valuable function. It has been the survey of record in elections for more than 50 years, and hopefully will continue to be the survey of record about exit polls and how the electorate has changed over the years. And I think it's an important part of our duties to make sure the methodology evolves with the times and how people vote to make sure it maintains that trust going forward.
Thank you both. I have a question about the after election night. When the election's over and all the dust has settled, what are the real world impacts of the exit polling, of what you learn about the demographics of voters? How are these used by, and I guess, how are they used and who are they used by?
Well, that's a great question. And I said, when it's the survey of record, it's not just used on election night by the news organizations that spend a lot of money to produce it, but it gets archived at the Roper Center for academics to use, but also politicians and political action committees and consultants use this data all the time to inform their view of the electorate and use it as debate material in terms of trying to explain the changes in the electorate and why certain candidates succeeded and certain candidates didn't. I think I think it becomes the framework of the debate about what elections mean after the elections, not just on election day. And Kathleen, as you know, the dust rarely settles now the next day. It sometimes takes days, if not weeks, to call elections, and even the exit polls or the voter polls in the future will take days to finalize, because we're always getting information dribbling in, especially in states that count their votes slowly, like California, in terms of what the final results are and what the proportion of by mail early and election day voters are. And we adjust the exit poll for days after the election to account for that information.
So, some of the ways in 1980, for example, the exit poll showed that Reagan was that people voted for Reagan because of his personality, not for his program. And at least we were the voice of the electorate. Now, that didn't stop Reagan from doing things. In this election, people voted around inflation, affordability for Trump. And it's there. Trump's not really paying a lot of attention to that, but the people that write about the election keep mentioning that. So we are we're sort of the continuing voice of the electorate, and I feel really proud of that.
And I'll add one more, Murray, in
Okay.
how sometimes the exit poll is there with the answer, and some of the politicians don't look at it. In 2022, the Democrats did a lot better than expected in the midterm elections. They only lost 9 seats in the House and they maintained the Senate. And the Biden campaign decided that that was justification for Biden to run for a second term. But if you actually look at the exit poll data, the Democrats actually won despite misgivings about Biden's performance as president and the future, and his approval ratings were in the low 40% in the exit poll in 2022, and they would remain so for the rest of his term. And the only reason certain Democrats and certain Senate candidates and House candidates won was despite the Biden disapproval. In fact, half the voters that said in our exit poll they somewhat disapproved of Joe Biden ended up still voting for Democrats that year because they had more qualms about the Republican candidates that were nominated in places like Pennsylvania and Georgia, et cetera. So the answers were there in the exit poll to warn the Democrats that having Biden run for a second term might not have been a good idea, but they chose to ignore it.
And let me add one as well. Yeah, in 1992, I got a question on the exit poll: "Are you gay or lesbian or bisexual?" And that one made quite a bit of news in because and it was the exit poll was like a perfect way of measuring because it was confidential. You didn't have any identification issues or any of the stuff like that. And at the time, I got a lot of grief from gay political people because they had been pushing that gay and lesbians are 10% of the population, which was a number from the Kinsey report. And I got a lot of grief from them. And then about 2 years later, Battelle did this fairly expensive survey of sexuality, and they came up with that gays and lesbians were 1%. So these same people were quoting the exit poll. And the other thing is the exit poll is actually the longest body of data, longitudinal data about gays and lesbians, because we've gotten it on every election. It was difficult some of the time to get it on because the exit poll you have to fight for space, and the space is determined by representatives of the networks and the AP or whoever, and so it was an effort to get it on all the time, but it seems to have some momentum now, and it's the longest record of tracking the size of that population.
Thank you. Someone would like to know how or do you need to get approval to be at the polling sites, and do you anticipate issues in the future with everything?
Well, it's very fortunate that exit polling, because it's run by news organizations, is protected by the First Amendment. We cooperate as much as we can with local, precinct, county, and state election officials to let them know where we'll be interviewing and the process by which our interviewers will be interviewing. The key point is we only talk to voters after they vote. So there's no way that an exit poll interviewer could be accused of electioneering and be forced to stand at the distances that electioneers are forced to stand. We've had to fight many cases in court. Many states have tried to put distance restrictions on exit poll issues, and when it's argued in court, because of the First Amendment protections here and the fact that we're only talking to voters after they vote, the right to exit poll still exists. That doesn't mean there aren't issues. There are always uncooperative local election officials that we have to deal with. We have a whole team that deals with that on election day to make sure local officials know that we're able to be there legally. But the other thing is, in the Trump environment right now, there's a lot more distrust of the voting procedures, and there are a lot more groups that are wanting to observe what is happening at the polling place, and sometimes our interviewers get caught up in that. But so far, we've been able to exit poll where we've chosen to exit poll and had voter cooperation in all those places.
Thank you. We have a question. Have there been huge discrepancies between the exit polling and the actual vote?
Murray, you want to talk about the history of that?
Huge discrepancies? I wouldn't say huge. There have been discrepancies for sure. But that's why that's one of the reasons we do weighting. We have, at least during my term, we had sample precincts. I don't know. How do you want to answer that, Joe? I don't know how to.
Look, the exit poll and the exit poll as it exists as a multi-mode survey and will exist going forward has margins of error just like any other survey. We don't have the issues, as Murray said, of building likely voter models in that we know we're interviewing voters when we interview, but we do know there's differential non-response. We do know that younger people are more likely to respond than older people, that higher educated voters are more likely to respond than lower educated voters. And we do the best we can to adjust for that differential non-response, just like any other survey adjusts for non-response.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Now there will be only one exit poll, the exit poll, rather than two as we've had since 2018, or as we had in the earlier days where there were individual networks doing their exits. Is this good, bad, or irrelevant?
Well, Murray may want to talk about the age where there were competing exit polls from each network. I was fortunate that my first job was at CBS News in 1988, which was the last year that ABC, NBC, and CBS each conducted their own proprietary exit poll. I guess as consumers of the Roper Center archive, everyone out there should make a judgment whether it was better to have competing exit polls or a single exit poll. The one thing about a single exit poll is that there seems to be a demand for a number. I remember in 2004 when one of the controversial numbers from the exit poll was the percent of the Hispanic vote that George W. Bush got. And in the NEP national exit poll, Bush received 44% of the Hispanic vote. If you did a weighted average of our 50 state polls from 2004, it was 40%. At the same time, the LA Times, and a shout out to Susan Pincus, who used to run their polling division, did their own exit poll in 2004, and they had 45% of Hispanics voting for Bush. And I believe in their post-election survey, Pew had 43% voting for Bush. So I would often get questions from journalists. Well, what percent of Hispanics voted for Bush? And I give that explanation. Well, if you use the national exit poll, it's 44%. If you use the weighted state surveys, it's 40%. The LA Times says 45%. The Pew says 43%. These are all surveys. They all have their margin of error. It's in that range. And the journalists would always say, but I want the number. I want to know what percent of Hispanics. And I think we just have to educate consumers of all surveys that there's measurement error, there's response bias, there's all sorts of reasons why we can't get the precise number, but we do the best we can, and everyone has to take it with the precision that it is entitled to. And that's a lot of the issues in general with the exit poll and election projections right now, we've lived in a period of time with so many close elections that consumers are demanding a precision from all surveys, whether the pre-election surveys or the exit poll, that when national elections like the last few are decided by less than a point in 3 critical electoral college states, no survey, the exit poll notwithstanding, has the ability to be that precise in their projections, and we all have to live with that.
So my answer is, would you want just one pre-election poll, or would you like just one poll today, period, and not 5 or 6 or 7 or 8? Um, I I think more is better. The thing is, more is a lot more expensive. And I think you're a lot better off if pooling your resources and having a very large, well thought out data set than in having a lot of competitors just trying to get their edge on each other. But it's not something, this decision is made by economics more than anything else. And so it's not like we're having choice.
So that economics question, we actually have a question here that's probably not something you can precisely answer, which is how much does each network pay to participate in the poll? I doubt that you want to give a number to that, but I think it is worth discussing what the sort of costs are involved in running an exit poll and how has that changed over the years?
Oh, God. Well,
Yeah, we cannot talk to how much the news organizations spend, but it is a multi-million-dollar operation to conduct national and state exit polls over a 4-year cycle.
I could give you a little idea just of the change. Like when I was doing it, we had sample precincts and we had exit polls. Now, in the 90s, when we started doing absentee polls. And so in the 90s, we had a few absentee polls. Now, the number of telephone absentee polls has grown drastically. And that's a whole other cost because the sample precincts, staffing exit polls, that's the same. Maybe you cut back on your exit poll precincts, but you don't cut that far back. So the costs have just gone up a lot that way, if nothing else.
Cost of everything and survey research has gone up.
And and inflation, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. We have a question. Who will count the vote now? Just AP or SSRS as well?
No, SSRS will be doing the voter poll and will be the survey of record, at least for 2025 for the news organizations. When it comes to California, New Jersey, New York City, and Virginia, SSRS will be doing state and national exit polls for the 2026 and 2028 elections as well. But the vote count will be coming to the news organizations from the Associated Press.
Okay. Just one final question. As you're looking forward, what are the challenges you see in exit polling? You're already addressing and making methodological changes. You've been making methodological changes. You continue to do so. But do you see any particular challenges that will be arising in the next election cycle?
Well, I'll start, I guess. I think the biggest challenge is the distrust of media and the distrust of polling. And that's very well correlated with voting. And that's a really big challenge. And that's one that I don't have now. And Joe does. But that I think that's by far the biggest problem. You've got declining response rates and you have really distrust of the media and science even.
Yeah, it's not just the news organizations. Every organization has declining trust, whether it's a sports league with a gambling scandal, or the Catholic Church with priest scandals, or you name it. Every organization out there has issues that they have to deal with, and the news organizations pay a lot of money for the exit polls. They're the sponsors of the exit polls. We do a lot of experimentation about how much to promote or not promote the news organization's involvement. As you saw in the ballot box picture that Murray showed, we put the news organization's logos right on the ballot box. We experiment all the time with either showing the network logos or not showing the network logos, and how much that affects response rate and bias in the survey. So that's one issue. And I think the other issue is just the changing methods in which people are voting and when they're voting. We have an election next week. I live in New Jersey. I've already voted. Before Election Day, nearly half the voters in New Jersey will vote either by mail or early in person. And each of those methods we know have different characteristics. Different Democrats right now tend to be much more likely to vote by mail. Republicans tend to be much more likely to vote on Election Day, and getting that balance correct in anyone's surveys, whereas the pre-election surveys or the voter polls on Election Day, is a big part of the accuracy now. I mean, I kind of describe it as like a three-dimensional chess thing. Murray, you just, back in the 60s and 70s, when 95% of people were voting on Election Day, you just had to have the best sample of Election Day voters. Now, I need to have three samples: the best sample of Election Day voters, the best sample of by-mail voters, and the best sample of early voters. And then not only that, I have to have the best estimate of what percent of people are voting Election Day, what people are percent are voting by mail, and what percent of people are voting early, and the demographic differences between the three. So it's almost like a 3x3 survey we're doing to hit all those targets. So that, I think, will keep evolving. The rules on voting keep changing. The pendulum between restricting voters or increasing access to voting keeps changing. It changes state by state, and we just need to make sure the methodology we're using to best estimate voter preferences in the elections keeps up with that.
Right. Makes it really much more complicated to wait to the truth, in Murray's words. We are we're 1 minute, but we have one more question I want to try to get in here. Someone said, Census Bureau surveys have also been affected by falling response rates, and Census Bureau surveys are one of the inputs used to calculate survey weights used in exit polls and election studies. What implications might this trend have for using exit polls and election studies to study voter behavior?
We don't use census data, do we?
No.
I don't think you
No.
do.
The voter poll is actually independent of the census. It is much more dependent on the registration rolls of each of the state and the voter history in each of the states and the accuracy of the demographics in the voter rolls. And there's a lot of money being spent to make the voter rolls much more accurate. And that's what we base the voter poll on much more. We have never weighted, with the one exception that I mentioned in 2018 when we introduced the education adjustment. That was based on the census election survey and the comparison historically between the exit poll and that. But in terms of census demographics, they're never used in the weighting of the exit poll, because that's a different population. That's the total population of the United States. We are only interested in the population of voters for that particular election, and the census doesn't really help us with that.
Separate problem, real problem, but a separate problem.
Yeah.
Well,
We get many separate problems.
yes, we do. It is 2:30, so I want to thank you both for just a fascinating presentation, for teaching us a lot about the history and the development of the exit polls, which we sort of take for granted now, as I thing that you've always had. I know that I get questions all the time. Can you send me the data from the exit polls from, the 40s? They didn't have exit polls in the 40s. Somebody had to come up with that first. So, uh, congratulations on the
Thank you.
well-deserved award. And I look forward to seeing you. And I hope many of those of you at home or at work next month in New York to celebrate their achievement. Thank you all.
Thank you.